Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, India's key strategic partnerships and important developments in different regions of the world that have a bearing on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode we are taking a close look at India's neighbourhood, which is in flames. South Asia and the extended neighbourhood are undergoing tumultuous times with huge upheavals, political instability as well as major conflicts in these countries are erupting. And why is this so? What is the fundamental reason for South Asia and beyond being so unstable? And what can India do about it? What can other foreign powers do about it? And how can India navigate this very, very tricky neighbourhood? This is the theme of today's episode. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to a very learned person who is joining me in the studio, Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh.
Thank you, Sreeram. Thank you for hosting this show.
Zorawar Daulet Singh is a well-known author and a geopolitical commentator. He has an expertise in Indian foreign policy, India-China relations and neighbourhood issues. Zorawar, great to have you on the show. Let me read out to you something that quite obvious but needs to be put in on record. 2021, Taliban takeover in Afghanistan and establishment of a hardline Islamist regime. Same year, 2021, military coup in Myanmar and end of the dream of democratic transition. 2022, economic collapse and regime overthrow in Sri Lanka, and the country was on the brink of total failure. 2023, we have a regime change in the Maldives through elections, but which brought Islamists to power and created huge upheaval in this region. Then 2024, we have a stolen election in Pakistan, and the former prime minister is jailed, Imran Khan, and he's still in jail. Same year, you have a regime overthrow now in Bangladesh by organized mobs who seem to have foreign backers. And now the kind of violence we have seen since this fall of Sheikh Hasina's regime has been quite horrifying, especially aimed at ethnic minorities. 2021 to 24, while this region, this period of last 3 years, Nepal, we have 4 prime ministers in a revolving door in the last 3 years. They keep coming, keep going out. So what I'm trying to ask you is, look at this picture all around us, and India looks like an island of stability, but we are surrounded, it's on fire, and everywhere you see huge unrest, dissatisfaction with the status quo, and rather undemocratic means and methods by which regimes are being toppled. So if you take a big picture view to start with, why do you think the subcontinent and adjoining areas have been like this? I mean, it's not a new phenomenon, but you're seeing that they're getting worse, it seems, and are unable to hold together. So let's talk a bit about this region as a whole and the macro level factors which you think are driving these failures or crises.
Right. So you've summarized a fairly a scenario that should be deeply troubling to the Indian policy making establishment, because this is now a period of over a decade where we've seen a domino effect, really. Obviously, each case has its own dynamics. Not all these states are contiguous to each other. The Pakistan-Afghanistan problem has a much older history. They've been great power factors that have also played a very deep role. But I think when it comes to states that are contiguous to the Indian heartland, share a direct frontier border with India, and there you see a loss of control of regimes that have been generally favorable and friendly to India. I think that's when we should ask questions on how is it that this kind of internal, whether you want to call it color revolutions, mob protests, overthrow of constitutionally elected regimes.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking of, our entire premise in the last, since the post-Cold War era has been, we are going to integrate with the subcontinent, increase interdependence. We are going to build a new South Asia. So this idea that pure economic interdependence can become a panacea for a prosperous, stable, cohesive subcontinent. I think this new liberal vision itself has been exposed. you can't just have connectivity physical, you need ideological connectivity, you need the identities and the belief systems of your ruling elites in the region to have something in common with the Indian experience, because after all, the civilizational foundation of this neighborhood comes from India's and the subcontinent's history, which is shared. We may have contested versions of that history, obviously partition, and you had multiple changes in the sovereign frontiers in the last 70 years. But that does not mean that India can retreat into a territorial shell and not play that role. So I think that's where Indian policymakers today need to grapple with the situation. Now there's a second debate, that is this mean the return of the old Raj? Does it mean an imperial policy? Does it mean a policy of interference? I don't think so. I think this idea that you have to lord over your neighbors is again an argument that's put across by Western scholars and Western policymakers who will shame India for playing a leadership role.
Yeah, that's the notion of hegemony. Yeah.
But that concept of hegemony has been placed that don't do anything because you will be seen as a hegemon. I think today there are friends in our neighborhood, there are friends in Bangladesh, for example, in real time today, that are seeking an active Indian role to safeguard their rights in whatever inclusive formation is formed in that future regime that takes place there. Now, to say that we can't interfere because it's a sovereign country and we're going to leave them to their own devices or this organic evolution, I think that's completely a very dangerous concept, particularly for the subcontinent where you have inter-ethnic, cross-ideological factors that don't listen or don't abide by the territorial boundaries that have been placed in the post-colonial era. I would just add also this idea of, let's face it, in all these countries, particularly Afghanistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, you have a large community of minorities. Let's not be afraid to call them, these are Hindus or non-radical groups that at some stage or the other seek their own survival and their political rights. If they can't get it from their own regime, India will have to at some stage ensure that the regimes in those countries provide that level of safety, comfort, because if they are being, I don't want to use a harsh word, but if there is another genocide in Bangladesh or any other, India cannot just be a passive bystander.
We can't afford it.
I think the past has shown, whether it's in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, we have played a role, a responsible role, responsible to ensure that those regimes are plural, are secular, are inclusive. Right. We may not succeed all the time, but the fact that you are not willing to play that role, or there are arguments that that role is not something which is suitable for India today, is a completely flawed argument.
Yeah, no, I take your point that there is nothing really in international relations called non-intervention. That itself, is a very loaded term. I'll come back to India and what we should be doing, but going back to the region, Zorawar, you already mentioned radical ideology and also ethnic issues. These have been quite big fault lines in the region, and it seems to me that even on that count, there's much that the Indian model can be a role model or as a template for building these nations or rebuilding them after many failed attempts. We've seen that in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, our federalism is so successful, and there the unitary state, the singleist dominated state, for a long time we had a huge issue. There was a ethnic insurgency and war for decades, and still it's very unsettled. So likewise with the Madhesi, the community, and in Nepal you have the Hindus in Bangladesh, and so on. You have this whole region where there are these minorities you're talking about, and warts and all, despite our own flaws, relatively speaking, we have been far more stable and successful in managing ethnic diversity, right? And it seems like that's one big issue that emerges, people often focus on regime collapse, meaning authoritarianism versus democracy, but underneath that, underlying it or interwoven into is this ethnic question. And you already mentioned genocides and ethnic violence and cleansing and these sorts of horrific things that have happened in the subcontinent. So there also it looks like there's something missing in their social fabric or nation building efforts, and that's also something where the Indian model should have been promoted maybe or at least socialized. Obviously we don't impose our will on any country, on any sovereign country. So do you want to talk a little bit about this ethnic question and this being one of the fundamental problems in South Asia?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point, because you look at the nationalisms and the identities of this entire region. India, despite having, let's say, on theoretically an ethnic majority, it is not a European nation state in that sense, right? It is a civilizational state which is sort of an all-encompassing, inclusive, plural, by its very essence. Not just by the constitution, which further reinforces those ideas, but there is a pre-existing DNA in the Indian sort of mindset. And why is it not happening elsewhere? Partly because the colonial period sort of had separated some of those entities, and it never really, and maybe the cultural spread was there and it kind of broke. I think coming to this idea of socialization, how does socialization happen? It happens through institutional contact, people-to-people contact, organic links at multiple levels, from civil society, media, elites, businesses, political leaders. I think that's where, we'll have to go case by case, and probably that's beyond our scope today, but I think there is again an argument to be made that India has not employed its comprehensive national instruments, mobilize the non-state sector within its own country to shape a particular policy towards, let's say, whether it's Myanmar, Bangladesh, Nepal. You always had, let's say, a highly securitized policy, which is then alternated between passivity, non-interference, and then coming again to some kind of interference in times of crisis. So this idea of there being an enduring, continuous engagement across the body politic of your neighbor, that is something that has been kind of lacking in India's neighborhood policy. Now that's a possibility of capacity and institutions within, but I think it's also an aspect of the strategic imagination and the will of a government in India to mobilize all parts of the government and non-government, non-state, to play a part in your regional foreign policy.
Right. So on the democracy question now, Zorawar, most of these regimes we are seeing the kind of opposition that is being mobilized. There is no peaceful transition of power through elections, through free and fair elections, and there are pressures building up, and then you have an explosive situation like we saw in Bangladesh. Here also India, arguably is the most successful democracy in the region, and with very stable polity, and where people play by the rules by and large, and the losers happily step down, and the winners come in, and incumbents, and there's turnover of power. All these things happen both at the central and at the state or the provincial level. Now this is arguably also something that the region could have adopted ideally from our point of view. Whether we succeeded in quote-unquote exporting our democracy to our neighbors or not is a difficult question, because each of them have their own domestic constituencies, many of which oppose India. Like we mentioned, there's this so-called anti-India factions in all these countries who say whatever good, anything we do for their betterment, there is this riposte that India is a big brother and is a bully and is interfering. So our model of democracy, and of tolerance and peaceful coexistence, this thing should have also perhaps played a bigger role.
So I think the first thing is, when we speak of this glowing concept of democracy, we often believe that it happens without any coercive backdrop. Now let's face it, Indian democracy, why is it surviving today? Why is there not this sort of violent overthrow from the streets in the future? Because you have the coercive power of the state that is always in the backdrop to impose order if there is a resistance which is unconstitutional. In the neighboring countries, we know, of course, the classic case of Pakistan, the idea of civil-military relations itself is a complete joke, right? You had democracy which was sort of smothered in the cradle in the 1950s, and then you have great powers that have sort of propped up these sort of tin pot dictators. But that's Pakistan as an extreme case. The rest of the neighborhood, there is a possibility and a potential where the idea of civilian control and democratic control of the military is something which is a powerful concept, which is not just unique to India, it's unique to all major countries, not just democracies the way the Western democracies. It even applies to the Eurasian great powers, to Russia, to China, to others. There is not this idea where the military runs these countries, right? They listen to the civilian leadership. That concept is something that has been sort of lost, and again, that's where India has to play the role, because you have outside great powers that have no problem whatsoever to disturb the civil-military balance, right? They've disturbed it in Bangladesh in the 1970s. I mean, frankly, you won the 71 war. Within a few years,
you had military coup,
I mean, you literally have Hasina's entire family wiped out 4 years after the first war. What was happening there? You have a military sort of dictatorship that comes in. You've seen it in other places. So today, let's not get into this idea that, oh, if democracy returns to Bangladesh, this superficial democracy, where frankly, this is a regime change, right? We're talking of a coup d'etat, we're talking of a color revolution that just happened on our doorstep, and we are sort of this blasé about it. I think today, if we want any kind of prospect, and let's not get into this specific case, but if you want stability in our neighborhood, the first thing is, I think, and it comes to a fantastic point you raise, the idea of civil-military relations, because both these facets, the civilian leadership and the elite, and the political and the military coercive instrument, because you need a military coercive instrument to restore and promote and underpin a political order in any entity.
Sure.
But if they are not on the same page, you're going to have this games being played out, you're going to have foreign actors that are going to come in and subvert the process. How does India do it? There is no way but to be involved and be engaged with those countries. You cannot say...
I mean, we do some of it, like, capacity building and training for civil society,
you have the
for
National
journalists.
Defence College, which is our premier training institution, and I believe you have senior Bangladeshi military officers in the current batch. So, I mean, that's like, okay, you're doing your military diplomacy. But beyond that, the fact that the current army chief in Bangladesh had good ties with the Indian military political leadership. I mean, these kind of links is where, in times of crisis,
we need to leverage.
You need to leverage those, and also I would add the deterrent power of the Indian military presence on our frontiers, because these are contiguous states. I'm not saying exercise the power, but the very fact that I mean, you go back to any instance in previous decades, I don't think a single decision was taken in a capital in the subcontinent without being conscious of the repercussions that might occur if there was certain decisions taken domestically, whether it's an invitation to a foreign power to build a military base or to impose repressive measures against minorities in those countries. They were always thinking, what will India think of those actions? Why is that not happening today? There is a brazen disregard of how Delhi is thinking. And why is that? Again, India's deterrent power. You may have all the tanks and the aircraft and the fancy planes, but if the other side does not believe that these are there and they could be used in a coercive fashion to bring you back into the state of a constitutional order, then what's the point? What is the purpose of Indian power?
Yeah, there have been a few instances where actually India militarily intervened. 1987, that was a disastrous intervention in Sri Lanka, and we suffered from that syndrome for a long time. 1988, there was Operation Cactus in Maldives to restore civilian rule against a potential foreign takeover. So, and subsequently there are allegations now and then that come up in the domestic political football of these countries that India is intervening and India is playing. But then let me also bring in the foreign powers that you spoke about. In all these cases, most recently with Bangladesh, there is no doubt that foreign players have stakes and are trying to expand their influence in these countries. Now, on one side there is China, and then of course the United States, the two great powers. They are vying, all over the world, not just in our backyard, but you see that very manifestly in countries like Bangladesh. But then to a lesser extent Pakistan, because of the the Islamic connection and the historical link with Bangladesh. Some factions in Bangladesh also are backed by Pakistan, although Pakistan is a very weak state and doesn't have the capacity to intervene as much as the way China can. So given that there are all these foreign players, historically we have had so-called doctrines like the Indira doctrine. It used to be spoken about in the 1980s, that we want to keep our backyard, quote unquote, free from meddling by external powers, right? To an extent that notion is still there, and we don't want to concede ground simply because that is getting surrounded, especially if it is China, it means getting surrounded by our adversaries, right? So in that context, people often say, okay, if there is a regime change and if it's unfriendly to India, then quote unquote we lost this country, we lost this neighbor, and then the Chinese have taken over. But I think that's also a fallacy, because it's not necessarily so clear that the Chinese are gaining and winning at India's advantage, because the reverse also happens. Pro-India regimes come in and then people say that it's a setback for China. So it's a cyclical thing. Every few years these things happen. But big picture, do we have a grand strategy, and should we have one for the neighborhood as a whole? While we do individual case to case, each has its own idiosyncrasies and peculiarities for managing these foreign powers. And we've been very disappointed with the US, because we thought that we were close strategic partners, but it looks like we don't see eye to eye with them, especially on Bangladesh, and we have not been able to coordinate with them. So what should be our approach, you think, to these foreign power problem? And the smaller countries often say that you people are coming and making us a playground. And we are like a theater where the big powers are coming and you don't see us as human beings. You often hear that critique also. Right. So how do we manage all these factors?
So I think firstly I would say this in response to, especially in the West and even in China, where they say India seeks this hegemonic sphere of influence in the neighborhood. You can't have these states only for yourself. I don't think that's at all been India's policy, except maybe for certain very, very brief episodes where you had this united Great Power coalition, maybe in the 70s against India. Today's policy, or the last several decades, has been, I think, on very robust grounds. India's neighbors have free choices to develop political, economic ties with all major powers, provided there are certain red lines are met, that the areas that are on India's periphery, which is their periphery as well, are not used in any kind of fashion to promote militarization or those kinds of activities, or even connectivity that may have a military connotation. So I think, and the neighborhood has responded to this quite positively. When you look at Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh during the Hasina period, they all espouse this idea of non-alignment or multi-vector foreign policies. They want to have ties with India, with the West, with Russia, with China. But that non-alignment is friendlier towards India in a sense. It's not aimed against India. As long as that happens, I think that's a very robust framework, something which India should promote, because you are saying you can have deep economic ties with anybody. Because after a while, I think it's a bit disingenuous or to say that you can't develop ties with China in the economic sphere. What if you can't provide them that alternative? So if India has internal structural problems in its economy, then you have to allow your neighbors to get developmental options from elsewhere. No problem at all. It's only when those development options move into military options is where the problem arises. And it arises for the simple reason that if a particular neighbor of India falls into not the pocket of a great power, but certainly becomes deeply aligned with one great power, it's going to invite another great power to compete. So what you are doing is, by retreating, you are aiding the expansion of a Cold War system on your borders, that even if it is not entirely aimed at India, is undermining regional security, because militarization in a tit-for-tat fashion is going to further complicate your picture and the regimes in the coming decades, because eventually when those great powers leave or are fatigued, as we saw in Afghanistan and we see elsewhere, who will pay the bill? The bill will be paid by Delhi and by Indians, right, for the post-crisis, post-conflict instability. So that's where, and I think coming to your point, I think it is curious that why is India, when it is supporting secular plural regimes, and you have the United States supporting radical regimes in the subcontinent, and I think this question should not be just brushed aside. It has a Cold War legacy. We've seen the use of radical Islam by Western policymakers to confront whether it was Soviet presence in the Middle East, in West Asia, but it was also used to undermine, by the way, nationalist regimes, whether it was Nasser's Egypt, you have parts of the Middle East, you have the Syrian example of Assad, the secular regime, which had Christians living in peace and harmony, and you have this ISIS and radical Sunni groups that were used to literally topple that regime. Now, who's on which side? I think the Hasina is a classic example, very similar to these cases. You have a secular nationalist regime, and India supporting the regime, supporting not just the regime, it's supporting the very ideological basis. And you have outside players, particularly in the West, that are very comfortable using radical groups. And it's part of the foreign policy, they don't even hide it.
But then it also runs counter to the idea that we have this comprehensive strategic
or this common democratic glue that makes them natural allies.
And not only that, we are supposed to be jointly countering the Chinese shadow in our backyard, and that in the Indo-Pacific. Bangladesh is in the Indo-Pacific. It's not in on planet Mars or Jupiter. So viewers, the sum of this very interesting discussion with Zorawar Daulet Singh is that we do have a problematic neighborhood. Every year or so we are seeing some major upheaval or tumult. Bangladesh is the latest one, but it's not going to be the last one. There are economic and social fault lines in these countries, but there's also the question of ideology, and that must be addressed. There's the question of democracy and authoritarianism that must be addressed. There's the question of foreign powers and their interference and intervention that must be addressed, and these are all not just for the region, not just for these countries themselves and the people of those countries and their elites, but also for India. And what we have tried to highlight in this discussion is that South Asia and beyond can only be stable if India plays a stronger hand. India has been involved. We are never completely, we don't look the other way when there is trouble in the neighborhood. We have tried to assist these countries in many ways to fix their domestic problems in many ways, but still there is this resentment against India which we need to counter, and there's also a lot of foreign interference, external powers with whom we need to coordinate better, because without that we will not be able to achieve our broader strategic goals. Let me thank Zorawar Daulet Singh for valuable and complex insights.
Thank you, Sreeram. Thank you again for hosting us.
Viewers, South Asia and beyond is not a pretty story. It is up in flames, and we will need to think about the ripple effects of that into India itself, and also India going out back again into these countries, maintaining our influence, maintaining our presence, and promoting the core values for which India is great: democracy, moderation, and pluralism. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.